in our practice. So if you look at epidemiology of hypertension, India has a huge burden of hypertension. And if you look at the statistics from various trials, it has been shown that from 1995 to 2020, there is almost doubling of prevalence of hypertension across India. Whether it is an urban population, where the prevalence of blood pressure is as high as 20 to 60% in various large cohorts in cities like Mumbai, Jaipur, Chennai, or if you look at urban area, the prevalence of blood pressure, even in rural area of Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Rajasthan, the prevalence is between 7 to 55%, huge burden of hypertension. If you look at some very recent studies, meta-analysis of recent studies done in India show that the prevalence of hypertension is as high as 33.8% on average in urban India and around 27.6% in rural India. In fact, in Gujarat also, a lot of pediatric population is having hypertension. And if you look at the map, Gujarat has high burden of high blood pressure. So contemporary data from over 100 countries suggests that on an average, only 50% of adults with hypertension receive BP lowering medication, with few countries performing better than this and many worse. This is despite the reality, the fact that a difference in blood pressure of 20 by 10 millimeter reduction is associated with a 50% difference in cardiovascular risk, which is a major risk. If you look at, this is a very famous rule of half in hypertension. Only half of blood pressure patients have been diagnosed. Only half of those diagnosed patients have been treated. Only half of those treated patients are adequately controlled. So roughly of 100 cases of blood pressure in society, only 12.5% are adequately controlled. And hypertension nowadays, we see multiple complications because of longevity, increase in longevity and better medications. If you look, every 20 to 10 millimeter blood pressure increment increases cardiovascular mortality risk by double. So if your blood pressure is 115 by 75 and it goes to 175 to 105, the mortality risk is almost 8 times. So blood pressure really is a dangerous cardiovascular killer. Now, there are two complications that we see nowadays very common in our practice. One is hypertensive heart disease, in which it starts with a diastolic dysfunction, then there is a left ventricular hypertrophy, then there is a heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, so-called diastolic heart failure, followed by heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. This is one complication which has come up very fast, very rapidly in our practice. And the second complication that we see common is atrial fibrillation. We see that the risk of developing atrial fibrillation is almost twofold in patients of hypertension. But this, besides various complications like coronary artery disease, a cerebrovascular stroke, a renal failure, these two complications are giving us a lot of problem in managing patients. Now, what should be the optimum blood pressure level? And we all believe that the blood pressure of 140/90 was good. SPRINT trial, which was first reported in November 2015 in New England Journal of Medicine, and very recently, that is about 15 days back or about a month back, in New England Journal of Medicine, the trial 5-year follow-up of intensive versus standard blood pressure control, so-called SPRINT trial, was reported. And this trial clearly showed that when you treat patients aggressively, intensively, to bring the blood pressure down to 120 systolic and 80 diastolic, there is a 25% reduction in primary outcome, that is a cerebrovascular stroke or a cardiovascular mortality. And there is a 27% reduction in cumulative risk, that is death from any cause other than total cause. And thus, if you look at across various age, gender, race, and previous cardiovascular disease, the intensive treatment is better as far as the outcomes are concerned. And if you look at infarction, stroke, heart failure, there is remarkable improvement when patients are put on intensive antihypertensive medication. The conclusion of this study was that among patients who were at increased cardiovascular, targeting a systolic blood pressure of less than 120 millimeter resulted in lower rates of major adverse cardiovascular events and lower all-cause mortality. This was better than targeting a systolic blood pressure of less than 140. The recent follow-up after 5 years again confirms the initial finding that we should target the systolic blood pressure to 120 millimeter. And therefore, it is very imperative that we diagnose the patients and very aggressively. And we have no excellent guidelines available for diagnosis and treatment of blood pressure. And this was American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology guideline published in 2017, then European guidelines in 2018, and you had Indian guidelines in 2019, and NICE, the UK guidelines in 2019. And I'll go through what they have suggested in management of blood pressure. But real game changer was 2020 International Society of Hypertension Global Hypertension Practice Guidelines. The previous guidelines were good, these guidelines, but they're all dominated by regions. They were ethnic problem, and therefore these guidelines have looked at problem of hypertension globally, and then they have found out various solutions for people across the globe. And they have now classified blood pressure as a systolic below 130 and below 85 is normal. A blood pressure between 130 and 139 is high normal. A blood pressure between 85 and 89 diastolic is high normal blood pressure. A patient is supposed to have hypertension when the blood pressure exceeds 140. Diastolic. A grade 2 hypertension is when the blood pressure exceeds 160 or the diastolic blood pressure exceeds 100. Now, there are various other additional criteria like office blood pressure and ambulatory blood pressure measurement, which will help us in clarifying and putting a patient in hypertensive risk category. If you look at various guidelines, whether it is American Heart Association guideline, ACC guideline, International Society of Hypertension guideline, or Indian guidelines, most of the guidelines recommend that a blood pressure, systolic blood pressure below 120 and diastolic below 80 is normal or optimal. And anything above 130 and systolic and 90 diastolic is high normal, and anything above 140 is grade 1 hypertension. So most of the guidelines believe that the ideal blood pressure goal is below 120 and systolic and 80 diastolic, and between 120 and between 130 and 139 you have a high normal blood pressure, which requires aggressive management. Now, how do you measure blood pressure? And these guidelines have given very good idea as to how we should measure blood pressure. Sometimes in our rush, we tend to forget some basic things. There are clear-cut guidelines that you should have a quiet room, comfortable temperature, 3 to 5 minutes of rest, and patients should be sitting like this with arm and the blood pressure machine at this level. Patients should have preferably a bladder which is empty, and you should take 3 measurements at 1 minute intervals and use the average of the last 2. And these are all guidelines recommendations. Now, there are sources of inaccuracy before measurement. For example, a heavy diet, a standing position, or attaching improper device to the patient and talking during the measurement. And because of white coat, there could be a variation of between 6 to 10 millimeter of blood pressure, and this could wrongly label a patient as either normotensive or hypertensive. And therefore, there are elaborate instructions on how to ask the patient to sit, which are the proper techniques for blood pressure measurement, which measurement should be considered important, and how good is the documentation of blood pressure that we have measured. And these are all very important things that we should keep in mind, because our putting a label is going to make a lot of change in outcome of patient. Now, blood pressure by itself is known to have huge variability. So you have bit to bit variability. So blood pressure in this bit may be different from the blood pressure in the next bit. And you have orthostatic blood pressure variability. When the pressure falls, when you get up, there is a diurnal variation in which there is a surge in blood pressure during morning, and there is a dipping of blood pressure at night. Then there is a day by day. So one day blood pressure could be different from the second day blood pressure. There is a visit to visit blood pressure variability. There is a seasonal variability because of hot weather, and there is a yearly variability. And these are all short-term and long-term variability, which can create or lead to various problems in cerebrovascular and cardiovascular system. And that is the reason that now a lot of societies and a lot of uh, CC, AHA recommend that you just should not rely on a clinic measurement. You should also recommend patient to have ambulatory blood pressure monitoring in certain cases, and you should encourage patient to have home blood pressure monitoring very regularly, and you should correlate your blood pressure finding with patient's home blood pressure monitoring. Now, there are excellent guidelines available on emergence of home blood pressure guided management of hypertension. How should you look at the blood pressure measurement which is done at home? How should you take it into your clinical treatment? And there are expert panel consensus recommendation even in Asia for management of and on basis of home blood pressure measurement. Depending on measurement at home, depending on the measurement at office, patients are classified as white coat hypertension when the patient has blood pressure only during clinic but doesn't have blood pressure at home. A patient has a blood pressure which is completely normal either at office or at home is considered as a normal patient. A patient having a blood pressure at home but no blood pressure in clinic for some reason is a patient of having masked hypertension. But it is a patient who has blood pressure which is high in office, a high out of office home ambulatory blood pressure is considered as sustained hypertension patient, and these are patients who require very aggressive management. If you look at blood pressure variation, it's usually a dip of blood pressure in everybody between 12 night and 3 night, almost 3 o'clock in the night, and that is known as nocturnal dip. And when you get up in the morning, there is going to be a morning surge, increase in blood pressure from 6 morning to 10 morning. Now this surge in blood pressure, if it is very high, can lead to cardiovascular trigger. If it is very low, can lead to CV stroke. So nocturnal dip, which is normal, is okay. If there is no dipping in at night, it could lead to a CV stroke. If there is an extreme dip, it can lead to coronary artery disease. If there is a huge morning surge of blood pressure from 6 to 10, it could lead to a high incidence of CV stroke and coronary artery disease. And therefore, it is imperative that we measure and take help of home blood pressure measurement, number one. Number two, we do document nighttime dip and morning surge so as to properly time the blood pressure medication, whether we should give dose at night, whether we should give dose at morning, or whether we should give dose in afternoon. Having seen measurement of blood pressure, now let us see how do we manage blood pressure. If you look, salt is a major culprit, and India remains a country which has one of the highest salt consumptions in world. If you look at this, the contribution of discretionary source to total dietary salt intake in India is close to 50%, which is very, very high. If you look at per capita, India has the highest salt consumption as compared to a lot of well-developed countries. Thus, salt intake, a high salt intake, is a major cause of blood pressure in India. And if you look at, if you reduce the blood pressure, salt intake to less than 2 grams a day, there is a remarkable blood pressure reduction in blood pressure. Even if you reduce blood pressure sodium to 1/3 of the original intake, there is going to be a reasonable reduction in blood pressure, and that is statistically significant. So as to say that salt restriction is a very important part of treatment of hypertension. Exercise remains another important tool to manage blood pressure, and there are various guidelines, but most of the guidelines say that aerobic exercise on all days of the week and resistance exercise on 2 to 3 days per week is helpful in management of blood pressure, and the duration of exercise should at least be 150 minutes or above per week, and therefore exercise will certainly help in reducing blood pressure. So if you look at various lifestyle modification like salt reduction, healthy diet, moderation of alcohol consumption, weight reduction, cessation of smoking, physical activity, reduction in stress, yogasan certainly helps in controlling blood pressure, complementary or alternative medicine, all these lifestyle modifications can certainly reduce blood pressure. If you look at the impact, for example, weight reduction can reduce blood pressure by 5 to 20 millimeter if there is a 10 kilo weight reduction. A salt restriction can reduce blood pressure by 8 to 14 millimeter. And dietary potassium intake, if it is increased, it reduces blood pressure by 4 to 5 millimeter. A good physical activity reduces blood pressure by almost 8 millimeter. And stopping alcohol also reduces blood pressure. Thus, each lifestyle modification combined together can give us immense benefit in controlling blood pressure in most of the patients. Now, consider 6 as enemies in our target of blood pressure. One of them is salt. Yes, you need to cut down salt. Sleep. Sleep in most of the patients is now inadequate. And on the other extreme, you have sleep apnea, stress, substance abuse, mainly tobacco, and sugar. Diabetes as a comorbidity is well known in patients of hypertension, and excessive or unknown use of steroid and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So these 6, if you take care, the chances of patient control of blood pressure becomes very easy. Now, having known now this lifestyle modification as an important tool in management of blood pressure, let us go to drug therapy. Now, what is an ideal drug? The treatment that we start should be rational, should be evidence-based in relation to cardiovascular morbidity and long-term mortality. Preferably, we should use once a daily treatment, which provides 24-hour blood pressure control. This improves compliance. This reduces pill burden, and therefore there is a better control of blood pressure. Treatment should be affordable, cost-effective relative to most of the other agents, and treatment should be well-tolerated. You should not have complications. And evidence of benefit of use of this medication should be available across the population in which it is used. For example, ethnicity, for example, gender. And this is important when we discuss beta blockers. If you look, management protocol says that you first advise all patients of hypertension lifestyle modification. This then goes on to managing the blood pressure depending on the gradation of blood pressure, whether it is 140 and to 160 or 160 and plus, and existence of comorbidities like diabetes, chronic kidney disease, a cerebrovascular accident. So these guidelines, the NICE guidelines and the Indian guidelines published in 2019 very clearly told that in younger patients, those below the age of 55 was the cutoff, use angiotensin receptor blocker or ACE inhibitor as a first line of treatment. When a patient is above 55, use a calcium channel blocker or a diuretic. And as step 1, step 2 would be a combination of these two with a diuretic, and step 3 would be a combination of RAS inhibitor, a calcium channel blocker, and diuretic. And then you have to add further drugs depending on blood pressure of the patient. But it was this path-breaking European Society of Cardiology recommendation which clearly said that no. Consider blood pressure as tuberculosis. Don't treat with one drug. Treat with 2 drugs. So they clearly recommended initial therapy should be a 2-drug combination, either ACE inhibitor or ARB and calcium channel blocker or a diuretic. Very clearly, it is written that consider monotherapy in low risk, very low risk patients consider monotherapy. But most of the patients should be put ideally on a dual combination, but a single pill, so that the compliance is good. Step 2 would be again same drug in a higher dose with diuretic. So there are 3 drugs now, 3-drug combination, and again 1 pill. So this is going to be a triple combination, 1 pill. And step 3 is going to be multiple drugs. And the last in the paradigm is beta blocker. We'll discuss that in short. This was a recommendation, European Society of Cardiology, which changed our approach to hypertension. Yes, go for single pill, 1. 2, start with a combination therapy like you treat tuberculosis. The same approach was recommended by International Society of Hypertension. That step 1 should be a dual double drug low dose combination of an angiotensin receptor blocker and a calcium channel blocker. Step 2 should be full dose of these 2 drugs, and step 3 should be a triple combination of an angiotensin receptor blocker or ACE inhibitor and calcium channel blocker with diuretic. And step 4, residual hypertension, you need to add spironolactone, not beta blocker. Again, believe me, this if you look at this slide of International Hypertension Society, there is no mention of beta blocker. If you go up and look at European guidelines, again, beta blockers are put as beyond step 3. We'll discuss that in a later slide. So only in low risk grade 1 hypertension or in very old patients or frail individual consider a single drug. Otherwise, in almost all patients, consider a double drug therapy. And depending on the comorbidity like a stroke, a heart failure, or ethnicity, you consider a diuretic or a calcium channel blocker and the combination thereof. So, very clearly essential guidelines and optimal guidelines. And they have very clearly written that use three combinations, each single pill combination is not available. And please use beta blocker only when there is a specific indication. And use thiazide diuretics only if thiazide-like diuretics are not available. Now, believe me, we all have been using a lot of beta blocker. I am using it. We have all been using thiazide diuretics, but most of the guidelines now say stay away from beta blockers, stay away from thiazide diuretics. Use thiazide-like diuretics. Now, let us go to one calcium channel blocker. We all know nifedipine, amlodipine, serendipine, peridipine, azildipine, nicardipine, ferrodipine. Now, these calcium channel blockers, the old one, this amlodipine, works on L type of calcium channel and blocks L type of calcium channel. And you have now newer drugs like cilindipine, which works on L and N type. And you have azildipine, which works on L and T type. And you have benidipine, which works on L and T and N. So a drug which amlodipine like works and blocks only one channel, the other drugs block 2 or 3 channels. And therefore, when you have a calcium channel blocker which blocks 3 channels, there is an additional advantage of reduction in heart rate and pulse rate. There is a reduction in glomerular pressure, and therefore there is a better renal outcome, and therefore there are all chances that patient will have improvement in renal function. Now, if you look at cilindipine, as I told you, because of its effect, it does not cause tachycardia, has improved renal perfusion and good renal outcome, and cilindipine therefore has better because of a dual blockade, no tachycardia, less edema, and various other good outcomes like better ambulatory blood pressure over 24 hours, and there is improvement in renal outcome. Zilnidipine, again, because it works on L and T type, it's a longer blood pressure reduction, decrease in heart rate, reduction in pedal edema, and has less anti-anginal, has better effect in coronary artery disease. If you look at benidipine, the one which blocks all the 3 channels, it has better outcome as compared to the other calcium channel blockers. But amlodipine causes a huge amount of gingival hyperplasia, and therefore I have had occasions in which I had to stop this drug. And another major side effect of this group of drug, calcium channel blocker, is pedal edema. 15% of patients in India develop pedal edema, and pedal edema is for various reasons, cosmetic reason and so on, is not acceptable to patient because the drug dilates arterioles and not the venules. There is increased capillary pressure, expulsion of fluid into surrounding tissue, and pedal edema. And therefore, because of pedal edema and because of gingival hypertrophy, there have been occasions in which I had to stop amlodipine and look for other drugs. So these are 2 side effects which are seen very common in Indian population. Now, let us look at RAS inhibitors or angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. Now, we know there are drugs like ACE inhibitors which stop conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. You have ARBs which block angiotensin 2 receptors, and you have aldosterone receptor antagonists which block effect of aldosterone. You have ACE inhibitors also called as pills, enalapril, lisinopril, ramipril, perindopril, and other drugs like pinapril and so on. And you have ARBs which are used very extensively in India, like losartan, telmisartan, olmesartan, valsartan, candesartan, and azilsartan. Now, if you look at the difference between 2 of them, we saw the site of action. ARBs in general are stronger drugs. ACE inhibitors are little weaker drugs. There is a high incidence of cough with ACE inhibitor. And in our clinical experience, it has been seen that angiotensin receptor blockers give better blood pressure control as compared to newer generation inhibitors. On the contrary, ACE inhibitors have better effects as far as renal outcome is concerned and as far as left ventricular dysfunction is concerned. A problem with ACE inhibitors is cough. Almost between 5 and 20% of patients treated with ACE inhibitors experience a dry cough because of accumulation of bradykinin. ACE inhibitors break bradykinin. Because of ACE inhibition, there is accumulation of bradykinin, which leads to dry, nagging cough, and we have to stop ACE inhibitors in number of patients. Now, that also is seen not to that extent, but some extent with ARBs as well. So there are three side effects of RAS inhibitors. One is dry cough, the second is worsening of renal failure, and third and very important thing is hyperkalemia. Quite a number of patients would have high potassium level when patients are put on ARBs. Now, if you look at renal outcome, it's going to be a 30% increase in serum creatinine after RAS inhibitors are started. This increase stabilizes within 2 months. In fact, this increase correlates well with long-term renal preservation, especially when creatinine is 1.4. So your patient whose creatinine is 1.4, and you put patient on, let's say, telmisartan 40 milligram, and the creatinine shoots up to 1.6. It's a reason to be happy that the drug is going to prevent, and in 2 months' time, the creatinine is going to come back to normal. You need to be careful about hyperkalemia. However, after 2 months, the creatinine level is high, 1, and 2. The creatinine level is more than 30%. That's a 2. Then I would look for other diseases, especially renal involvement and proteinuria. Now, what is the role of diuretics in hypertension? And you have a lot of diuretic thiazides. We have been using hydrochlorothiazide and chlorothiazide for years together. Adelphin acidrax was a major drug in past, and you have a lot of combinations containing H or hydrochlorothiazide, and you have thiazide-like agent, chlorthalidone and indapamide, and they are supposed to be the best diuretics for management of hypertension. And then you have potassium-sparing diuretics, triamterene, aminoride, and aldosterone antagonists and loop diuretics. Loop diuretics are not used routinely for management of hypertension. If you look at the effects of diuretic, they reduce cardiac output, they reduce plasma volume, increase plasma reactivity. Long-term treatment, they decrease blood pressure on both short-term and long-term effect. And therefore, diuretics are very essential in management of systemic blood pressure. If you look at chlorthalidone and indapamide, two very good drugs. They have good bioavailability, good volume of distribution, and excellent 24-hour profile, and therefore very good addition in management of blood pressure. The side effects of diuretics are very well known. Hypokalemia is one of them. Hyponatremia is there, and hypovolemia, and on a long-term use, disturbances in blood sugar and uric acid elevation are seen with patients who are on long-term diuretic therapy. Now, what is the status of diuretic as antihypertensive? We saw that most of the guidelines recommend them as a combination and at least as an add-on drug in step 2 or step 3, and they are excellent drugs for management of blood pressure. Let us come to the most widely used blood pressure drugs, beta blockers. I'm sure all of us know that James Black got Nobel Prize in 1988 for discovery of propranolol. It was left to Franz Mazzarelli from Mount Sinai, New York, and Shripal Bangalore, again from Mount Sinai, New York, to break or to dispel the myth of beta blockers as antihypertensive. If you look at beta blockers, there are non-selective beta blockers like propranolol. There are second generation beta blockers like atenolol, bisoprolol, metoprolol, and then you have third generation beta blockers like carvedilol and nebivolol. Hard-hitting articles. Dr. Franz Mazzarelli, Shripal Bangalore wrote some excellent articles. The first article came in 1998, in which they reviewed beta blockers as first-line therapy for hypertension in elderly. And they showed that beta blockers were actually harmful to patients who were elderly and were put on these drugs for hypertension. And then there came another paper in JAMA that beta blocker use and clinical outcomes in stable outpatients with and without coronary disease, again showing that beta blockers were not of great use in hypertension. And therefore, they wrote this controversy article, should beta blockers and diuretics remain as first-line therapy of hypertension? And Franz Mazzarelli and Shripal Bangalore wrote that risk-benefit assessment of beta blockers preclude their use as first-line therapy in hypertension. In fact, John Cockcroft from UK, who was one of the pioneers of introducing beta blockers, clearly wrote that atenolol is dead. Please don't use atenolol. Then this came in 2008 in Czech, Journal of American College of Cardiology, but long live beta blocker. He said that please don't use atenolol. Now, why is this important? If you look at meta-analysis of various beta blockers in total mortality, infarction, and stroke, versus placebo, versus other antihypertensive, versus diuretics, versus calcium antagonist, and versus angiotensin receptor blockers or RAS inhibitors, there was no benefit with beta blockers. So beta blockers, authors and now the consensus believes that have role in acute coronary syndrome, have role in stable angina, have role in perioperative hypertension. There is strong evidence of their use in heart failure and infarction, but the use of beta blocker in hypertension has very weak or almost negligible evidence. And therefore, the new recommendation is that if you are a patient of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, please use beta blocker like carvedilol, like metoprolol, like bisoprolol. If the patient has coronary artery disease and symptomatic accessory angina, by reducing heart rate, by reducing neurohumoral activation, and by you can offer these patients beta blocker benefit for reduction in angina. But for hypertension, if the drugs are not going to be helpful, they may actually harm. And therefore, it is very clear that beta blockers are not preferred agents for management of hypertension as of 2021. Although UDP-80, as all of us know, and atenolol continues to be #1 blood pressure drug in India, there is now a strong move to get out of atenolol and move to other drugs. So, given a choice in some patients in whom I use beta blocker, I use either bisoprolol, nebivolol, metoprolol, or carvedilol. I'll take that point last. And you have now last group of drugs known as alpha blockers, like prazosin and doxorubicin. They are basically vasodilators. Most of alpha blockers now are used more for prosthetic enlargement. And your sympathetic drugs, alpha-2 agonists like methyl dopa and clonidine, which work at the level of brain, and therefore they decrease central sympathetic outflow and are used in management of resistant hypertension, in refractory hypertension, and methyl dopa sometimes is used in pregnancy-induced hypertension. What about combination therapy? And I'll come to that. So you have a combination, an ideal combination would be an ACE inhibitor and a calcium channel blocker, or an ACE inhibitor and a diuretic. And acceptable combination would be a diuretic with either calcium channel blocker or angiotensin receptor blocker, or sometimes with beta blocker. If you look at A, B, C, D, a diuretic group, chlorthalidone, indapamide, hydrochlorothiazide, B, ARBs, telmisartan, olmesartan, valsartan, candesartan, and C. You can combine A, C, and D, A, B, and D. So you can have one diuretic group A, one from B, and one from D, and you can safely use them as combination therapy. However, combining B and C, so ACE inhibitors and ARB, is going to be harmful. This is a rational combination. An irrational combination is a drug like atenolol and losartan, because atenolol is a long-acting drug, losartan is a short-acting drug. A combination of ACE inhibitor and ARB because they cause hyperkalemia, and a combination like losartan and amlodipine because losartan is a short-acting drug and amlodipine is a long-acting drug. Now, what are the drugs on horizon? Some excellent drug, a drug like sacubitril valsartan, which has completely changed the outcome of patients of heart failure. And this drug has remained a marvelous drug and gives wonderful effects in patients of heart failure. Now, this drug is tried in systemic hypertension, has given good results. The concept is this inhibits natriuretic peptide. Then there are drugs like vericiguat, which is the stimulator of 5-guanyl cyclase. Then your mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists like finerenone, abiraterone, which are going to be of great in management of hypertension in future. A new drug, ribastard, which is a first-in-class brain aminopeptidase A inhibitor, is also used, is tried in patients of hypertension and has given good results, but it has not yet come in the market. So these are 3 or 4 drugs which are on horizon. There is a hope scope for renal sympathetic denervation in management of hypertension. Again, that issue is still dicey, and I will not discuss that with you. So let us now go down to some pulse. The question is, if my patient is on thiazide and atenolol, should I change to a new drug? Yes, yes, yes. Stop thiazide, put him on chlorthalidone. Stop atenolol, put him on bisoprolol or nebivolol, or preferably ACE inhibitors, ARB or calcium channel blocker. Number 2, my patient is on amlodipine, telmisartan or metoprolol. Should I change to a new drug? Yes, if the patient has a complication like edema. Yes, if the patient has cough. Yes, if the patient has bradycardia. No, if the patient is asymptomatic. Please don't make an asymptomatic patient suffer because a new drug has come on horizon and it offers some excellent results or it offers achhe din. My patient is on amlodipine and has developed leg edema. Shall I change over to newer calcium channel blocker? So shall I change over to cilindipine and or azilindipine? Well, it is worth trying, but there are chances that putting the patient on cilindipine or putting the patient on azilindipine may also lead to edema. Question 4. Which diuretics, calcium channel blocker or RAS inhibitor or beta blocker shall I start when a patient has been first diagnosed by me? Yes, the first drug is going to be a calcium channel blocker, would be a benidipine, cilindipine or amlodipine. And ARB would be telmisartan or olmesartan. A diuretic would be chlorthalidone and indapamide, and a beta blocker, if at all, would be bisoprolol and nebivolol. Do all my hypertensive patients require aspirin? No. Do all my hypertensive patients require statin? No. The home BP, that patient brings his home BP record, is always very, very different from my clinic or office BP. His machine shows it as 180/100 and my mercury or my NRI machine shows it at 120/80. Which machine is reliable? Both. You need to cross-check his blood pressure machine. You need to calibrate his home blood pressure machine. But believe me, most of the patients are now going to come to us with home blood pressure measurement done on an Omron machine or done on any other machine, a Chinese machine. And therefore, we are going to face this problem. We need to calibrate these machines. If I have to conclude my talk, hypertension prevalence is high and is increasing across age, gender, ethnicity, rural or urban population. Hypertension remains poorly controlled in most of the patients. Only 12.5% patients are well controlled, leading to multiple cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, and renal complications. 130/80 is the cutoff for blood pressure, and 120/80 is the new cutoff target blood pressure. So if the patient has a blood pressure of 134/84, I'll put him in observation and I would try to bring to a goal of 120/80. Ambulatory and home blood pressure measurements are recommended for better diagnosis, compliance, and better control. Emphasis on lifestyle modification, salt reduction, exercise, stop smoking, weight reduction is very crucial in all hypertensive patients. Low dose combination therapy as initial therapy and as add-on thereafter is cornerstone of blood pressure therapy as of 2021. RAS inhibitors, that is angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, ARBs, calcium channel blockers, and diuretics are preferred antihypertensive agents in all patients. Beta blockers are fourth in step care approach. Atenolol should not be used. Newer drugs and renal sympathetic denervation will change hypertension outcomes in time to come. I thank you for your patient hearing. If there are any questions, I'll be pleased to answer.
Thank you, Rumin. You can stop sharing the screen so that we can have a view of all.
Sure.
So thank you, Rumin. It would be lovely if we can see your face. But anyway, it was a wonderful talk. It was a wonderful talk. Like this subject itself is like a marathon, but you have finished in a sprint, and that only you can do that way. You have covered so many aspects of hypertension, especially the last part where you actually answered few questions. Actually, that was very, very useful. And now I'll take up some comments and questions from the chat box. Dr. Pradeep has asked, tobacco cessation, does it have any effect or not?
Tobacco is considered to be a major risk factor in blood pressure, and stopping tobacco is certainly going to be very helpful in management of blood pressure as a major lifestyle modification. Right. Certainly.
Thank you. Then Dr. Gopal Agarwal has asked salt restriction details, how to follow practically. He wants to know about how you advise to the patients regarding salt restriction.
So there is a rigid advice in which I ask the patient to make completely salt-free diet and then have 5-gram salt sachet, which they can use in anything, a dal, sabji, or whichever way they want. That is going to be a little rigid advice of total 5-gram salt a day. The practical advice is that number one, no table salt is to be added when you are eating, number one. So don't add any table salt. Number two, if you have a major meal as lunch, your dinner should not have any salt, like say bhakri and doodh, for example. Or if you are very comfortable with vegetables, take vegetables with salt and dal without salt. So cut down salt in either dal or vegetable or lunch or dinner. And that roughly gives a salt reduction to almost to the tune of 40 to 50%.
Right. There is one Dr. Samir. I don't know whether he is an adult physician, because we know one Dr. Samir Shah who is a pediatrician, but he seems to be a physician. Sorry, I am not knowing about him, but he has put some very interesting remarks about salt restriction, that it also activates renin-angiotensin and aldosterone axis, which nullifies these effects of salt restriction. And then he has also put a comment about the potassium, that what about potassium intake? Our potassium requirement is 4,700 milligram a day, and more than 90% of the population is deficient. So no one is talking about it. Ironically, the same trials also mention that, but still not being highlighted. Potassium is definitely more important than salt restriction in controlling blood pressure. Your comments, Rumin?
I have clearly shown in lifestyle modification that increased intake of potassium, mainly through fruits like banana, orange, and coconut, is going to be helpful. And I've shown that in potassium intake reduces blood pressure by 4 to 6 millimeter mercury. So that is one thing. So potassium intake, a high potassium intake as a lifestyle modification is certainly recommended, has beneficial effects, and has proven. Now coming to salt. Now there is that salt and hypertension itself is one of our talk. But anyway, there are salt sensitive hypertensive patients and salt. There are patients who are not salt sensitive, and that for that you require elaborate tests like 24-hour urinary sodium excretion. And depending on profile of the patient, you need to exactly decide and advise about salt restriction. Now those things are esoteric, not practical, and therefore we usually give blanket advice of reducing salt to 5 grams a day. But salt sensitive hypertension in India, 60% of patients are salt sensitive. Between around 30% of patients are not salt sensitive.
So that's something very interesting, because at least I never knew about salt sensitive and salt not sensitive. Good. Then there is one question from Dr. Ashwin Shah. Antihypertensive medicine, should it be taken in morning or night, and what is ideal time? I think you mentioned about it, but you can repeat a general instruction.
There is a Spanish cardiologist who has done a huge work on chronobiology of hypertension medication, and he has shown that taking angiotensin receptor blockers or RAS inhibitors at night will prevent morning surge the second day and will prevent CV stroke. So the recommendation is that take at least one antihypertensive pill at night. Now, if you recommend a calcium channel blocker also at night, there's going to be diuresis and the nocturia. So if you are giving a combination, I would give it in the morning. If I have to give angiotensin receptor blocker as a solo therapy, I would give it at night. And if diuretic is to be given, it is given in the morning. Roughly, calcium channel blocker, diuretic in the morning, angiotensin receptor blocker at night, and preferably if there is a single drug at night to prevent the second day morning surge and to prevent stroke and ischemic heart disease.
Right. So there is a question from Dr. Pradeep. Quite often it is seen in practice that young patients with no heart failure or angina symptoms and without any evidence on TMT, they have been prescribed beta blocker, metoprolol, sustained release. How to taper and omit? Is it wise once started? And what is the risk of ischemia in such patients?
It is completely safe to stop beta blocker after tapering. The two complications, tachycardia, palpitation, if they occur, you could taper them from, let's say, 50 to 25 to 12.5, and then alternate and stop it. It is completely safe to stop beta blocker in any patient. Unlike clonidine, there is not going to be any rebound hypertension. Only thing, if there is even a little bit, or if there is coexisting angina, there is going to be worsening of angina. So after excluding a significant coronary artery disease, it is very safe to stop metoprolol or any other drug, and you taper it, and there is not going to be any reflex tachycardia or a rebound.
Right. Then there is a question regarding, this is from Dr. Praveen Pide, a very regular attendee to our Saturday club. So nice to have him asking a question. How do you compare azilsartan with other ARBs?
So azilsartan is a new drug. The drug has the evidence, if I'm talking, is that it has better effect as far as renal outcome is concerned, and it has better 24-hour profile. So this is the evidence base. On only from practice or anecdotal evidence, I can say that azilsartan is a very strong antihypertensive drug. And whenever my patients have failed to respond to 80 milligram of telmisartan, they have certainly responded to azilsartan. So azilsartan remains my trump card for managing those patients who are not responding to telmisartan. But this is not evidence-based, this is anecdotal. Evidence-based, it is a wonderful drug with good effects on kidney and a 24-hour profile.
Right. And Dr. Sulin Trivedi, who's a pediatrician, has asked about when do we consider actually the treatment of hypertension if somebody has BP in the range of 120 to 40 by 80 to 90 in absence of any comorbid conditions like diabetes, obesity, etc. Should we consider treatment for hypertension in such patients?
So anywhere between 130 and 140 is high normal blood pressure. And I would observe, I would put the patient on lifestyle modification and monitor the blood pressure. In such patients, when there is a dilemma, I always resort to ambulatory blood pressure for 24 hours and then find out whether patient has worsening of blood pressure during early morning or there is a huge nocturnal dip. And depending on that, I decide treatment. By and large, I start treatment when the patient's blood pressure exceeds 140 systolic and 90 diastolic.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Samir Contractor. Sorry, I didn't recognize that this Samir is Samir. Samir Contractor is a very well-known speaker in Saturday Club. In last 3 months or so, Rumin, he has talked about diet and all thing, cholesterol, etc. in 3 sessions. And he has again commented about banana having only 300 milligram potassium and being a poor source of potassium. So I think what you can elaborate is about what are the various fruits which are good in good as source of potassium.
Absolutely. So orange is.
Satish bhai, just a second. When I asked this question and when Dr. Rumin Shah was responding, something wrong with my audio. I couldn't hear his answer.
So what I will do, Praveen bhai, what I will do is that we are recording this meeting. I will share the link later on to you.
Okay, please. Right. Thank you very much.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Back to Samir's comment about potassium, Rumin.
Right. So potassium intake is I think potassium banana, as is rightly say, is low. Then I would recommend orange. Then I would recommend coconut water as an additional potassium supplement, especially in hot weather.
Right. Then there is a very simple question about, can we replace rock salt with normal salt?
No need. You just cut down normal salt to 5 grams a day. You just use normal salt, but 5 grams a day. That's going to be equally effective. No need to do that.
Right. So it was so good, Rumin, you asking all the questions like rapid fire session that we had. Excellent, very specific, very authentic looking comments, so that nobody can actually doubt whatever you are saying is very much evidence based with so much quotes of various references. There is lastly one comment again: green leafy vegetables and especially kale. Kale are excellent sources of potassium.
Yeah. Can I just share 1 minute? Can you just give me 1 minute?
Yes.
I'll share the screen for a minute. And this is the slide that I showed about potassium. That look at this: enhanced intake of dietary potassium. Aim for 3,500 to 500 milligram per day, preferably by consumption of a diet rich in potassium, and that reduces blood pressure by 4 to 5 millimeter. This is a well-documented thing, and as rightly said, I'm not too sure about what, but his point is very valid. Yes, I agree.
Okay, so I think we can still have 5 minutes of interaction. Of course, it is almost reaching 9 o'clock, but your talk has been so good, Rumin, that I'm sure people who are not written questions may also be interested in asking some questions. So it's open for next 5 minutes. Then we'll close the meeting.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding age-related increase in blood pressure. Suppose patient is 85 or 90, will he to reduce?
So till now it was believed that roughly 100 plus age would be a good systolic blood pressure. So 160 blood pressure for somebody who's 60 years, or 170 for somebody who's 70 years, and 180 for somebody who's 180 years is an acceptable range or acceptable limit of systolic blood pressure. But various trials, including trials in elderly, have shown that any blood pressure above 140 is deleterious, more so if it crosses 160. And the only recommendation is that you don't treat elderly very aggressively. Don't treat them with diuretics because they are likely to have hyponatremia and volume loss. Don't treat them with huge amount of beta blockers because they will have bradycardia. But a calcium channel blocker is going to be very safe in such patients and will give very good results. So age, even despite the age, a systolic blood pressure of 140 is an acceptable upper limit even in patients who are having no or some comorbidity as far as age is concerned.
Looks like hypertension is a very dynamic science, Rumin, that
Absolutely, absolutely.
the things change.
One question, Satish bhai, if time permits.
Yes, please.
Romin bhai, how often do you screen your patients for primary aldosteronism, and what is the percentage of patients of hypertension who are having in this your practice?
Yeah, primary aldosteronism is usually a refractory blood pressure that we see. Although I haven't seen so many patients screening with help of potassium unprovoked on diuretics. So patient comes to me. Usually we don't do potassium screening in all patients. But when the blood pressure is not responding to the treatment, I stop diuretics, stop ARBs, and send them for potassium level. And that is one thing which can help me in early diagnosis of primary aldosteronism. Now that report in Western literature is 10% of all refractory hypertension. But in my practice, I have not been able to diagnose so much of primary aldosteronism as a cause of hypertension.
Other day I was attending a webinar. They said that the percentage of primary aldosteronism in case of resistant hypertension is about 30 to the tune of 30%.
Oh,
and they were of the opinion we are missing most of the primary aldosteronism.
Quite likely. I completely agree. Quite likely. I'll agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
How frequently electrolytes should be monitored?
If the patient is on angiotensin receptor, if the patient is on diuretic and or angiotensin receptor blocker, in diuretic, I would be worried about sodium. So in an elderly patient, I would monitor sodium and potassium every 3 monthly. If the patient is on angiotensin receptor blocker or ACE inhibitors, I would be concerned about potassium, and then I would monitor potassium at least 6 monthly. If the patient is on multiple drugs, potassium sparing diuretic, then I would monitor it more frequently. And if there is a history of hyponatremia, I would monitor sodium very frequently, maybe 1 month, every month.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Dr. Vijay from Halol.
Yes.
One question for Rumin bhai. Can you highlight one for our surgical patient who are hypertensive and we are taking the patient for surgery? I mean, any specific antihypertensives that we have to start or we should have to change, or what are the intraoperative consequences if different type of any drug has reaction with our anesthetic agents?
So there are excellent guidelines about perioperative hypertension. Most of the guidelines recommend beta blocker as drug of choice so that there is no tachycardia and the blood pressure control is very proper. However, recent literature objects to beta blocker as agent of choice for management of perioperative hypertension. Still, to be very practical, I would put the patient on a short-acting beta blocker, like metoprolol 25 mg twice a day, pre and perioperative, and the drug interactions with most of them, anesthetic agents are minimal, and it's going to be very safe. There won't be any precipitous fall in blood pressure as well, and the heart rate will be maintained.
Rumi, there is a question in the chat regarding till when should one take a beta blocker, Ramipril 2.5 prescribed in the LAD stent 4 years, non-hypertensive.
So, presumably, when a patient had been treated with LAD stent, a beta blocker was prescribed as secondary prophylaxis to prevent myocardial infarction. And that is very valid, and I would take it indefinitely. Ramipril has been prescribed to prevent LV systolic dysfunction. Maybe there was an evidence of mild systolic dysfunction. So if that systolic dysfunction has completely disappeared and the ejection fraction is normal, I would stop Ramipril. I would take beta blocker indefinitely in post-MI patients, irrespective of symptoms. to prevent secondary infarct because of arrhythmia or second ischemic event.
Can I add something to this?
Yes, please.
Yeah, there was a HOPE trial which said that Ramipil 10 milligram, if it is given, it is definitely will be very useful in all cases of coronary artery disease and can be continued lifelong.
Completely agree. Completely.
Romin
Agree.
bhai,
Yes, please.
Romin bhai, Dr.
Yes.
Tushar Kapsi. Regarding
Yes,
the Vijay's questions, I have found since last 30 years and in all our Indian anesthesia journal and all world journal says that most likely antihypertensive drug during the anesthesia perioperative period is esmolol, because esmolol is liked by almost 100% anesthesiologist. It is very short acting and it
Right,
causes
right.
bradycardia, it causes hypotension. So we are using like an emergency friend for the anesthesiologist when the patient is on a hypertension or it shoots up the hypertension during anesthesia. So my advice is that only use esmolol, no nitroglycerin, no other drugs except this esmolol.
So esmolol is a wonderful beta blocker, but it has a very transient effect, and therefore the effect disappears in no time. And it is good as a bolus treatment to treat a surge in blood pressure. It may not be a good agent to take care of blood pressure 6, 8, 9 hours. So if there is a sudden surge for tiding over the crisis, yes, it could be a good. It is like taking sublingual nitroglycerin to tide over angina. That is going to be a good drug, but it is not going to have any role post-operatively. Point taken, if there is a hypertensive crisis with tachycardia, esmolol injectable because of its ultra short acting may be a good addition.
Just one another question. During in the same study, if you have taken the patient in an emergency and having a LVF is 20% or 30%, or patient has sudden hypertension on table, I mean, does any medication have interaction with LVF? I mean, ejection fraction is 20-30% and has taken patient in emergency without screening most.
So in
I mean,
some
any
patients,
drug.
I would make sure that there is a good, As far as managing such patients is concerned, I would take care of volume, but none of the drugs will cause further worsening. Beta blockers are not going to worsen heart failure. ACE inhibitors are not going to. If you do give calcium channel blocker, there might be some worsening of heart failure, but not on immediate. So none of the drugs will cause worsening of heart failure per se in a perioperative period.
May I add something, Rumin bhai?
Last comment, Dr. Praveen,
sir-
last comment now.
Suddenly, if the
Sure.
blood pressure goes up with a reduced ejection fraction, I think nitroglycerin will be very helpful in these cases. That will reduce the blood pressure and that will offload the heart also.
Vinodile, very good. Yeah.
Okay, so friends, we'll end the session here. Once again, Rumin, excellent presentation as well as excellent interactive session. Thank you for your time. I know you are a very popular physician. A lot of patients must be waiting for you now.
Thank you.
So
Thank
we
you.
end
Thank
the
you so much.
session here. And of course, there is always a demand for good speakers, and already a demand has come for inviting you again for talking about diabetes and hypothyroidism. So we'll
Sure.
be
I'll
looking
be there.
forward to one more session with you in coming
Sure.
months. So
Thank you so much.
thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
everybody.
Thank you all for very
Thank you.
interactive session. We say
Thank you.
goodbye now and meet next Saturday again. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.